Great. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Kim Lowe and I've got the privilege of being the Director of ARI. So normally you'd have Fiona Haynes from ARI introducing the seminar, but she's currently taking well-deserved recreation leave and we'll see her back in July. So here we go. I'd certainly like to welcome everyone to our latest seminar. Thanks for joining us. Just a reminder that we'll be taking questions at the end of the seminar and we'll use the chat function that you can see on your screen. So please add your questions as we go. You can add those at any time. And then Andy will go through the questions at the end of the session and call them up one at a time. So please use your chat function. Today's seminar is going to be delivered by Dr Ashley Sparrow from the Institute. And this seminar is part of our celebrations of World Environment Day that was held last Saturday. And the theme for this year's World Environment Day is around the theme of restoration, reimagine, recreate and restore. And hence Ashley's talk today is on this topic. Now, Ashley leads the riparian and wetland ecology program at the Institute, and he also has a dual role as principal scientist for strategic projects and staff development. And he does both of those within the applied ecology section at ARI. We were lucky enough to have Ashley join ARI late in 2017. He's currently focused on catchment, floodplain and wetland processes and their management. And he's got a broad background in landscape, vegetation and soil ecology, as well as incredible experience across a range of ecosystem types, from hot deserts to temperate rainforests to Antarctic dry valleys. So you'll see some of that in his seminar today. His skill set includes systems thinking, participatory action research, monitoring, evaluation and biostatistics. So an incredible depth and breadth of experience. That's why we're so lucky to have Ashley as part of our institute. So today his seminar will demonstrate some of this incredible experience. So it's my pleasure to now thank Ashley for being with us today. Over to you, Ashley.
Kim, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to present a seminar in commemoration of World Environment Day. Before I leap into the subject matter, I'd first like, on behalf of everyone that's joined today, to acknowledge the traditional owners and their elders on all of the lands from which we join today. But perhaps a little bit unusually, I'd like to go a step further because of the commemoration for World Environment Day. I'd like to ask all of you to just reflect for a moment on what World Environment Day might mean for traditional owners. The deep and spiritual significance of country to First Nations people, the amount of environmental change that's been wrought on country as a result of English colonial rule and waves of settlement over the last 250 years, the current state of Australia's lands, waters and ecosystems, and the objectives and implications of any ecosystem restoration and the opportunities for this to become part of a healing process between First Nations peoples and other Australians. As Kim indicated, this seminar is in some ways part of ARI's commemoration of World Environment Day, and the theme for World Environment Day this year is ecosystem restoration. And I'll talk in detail about some of that shortly. The other thing I want to say is you'll notice in my title the word art. I'm not really going to focus on the science of ecosystem restoration. So I'm not going to be talking to you about building soil carbon or how to get seed to germinate from Australian ecosystems, or direct drilling or nest boxes or any of those sorts of things that might be part of an ecosystem restoration program from a science perspective. Instead, I'd like to talk about other dimensions of restoration, dimensions that might encompass things like philosophy, sociology, even economics occasionally. And as a result of that, I'm going to take a little bit of an anthropological approach So my first examples are going to be for cultures other than my own. So I'll start talking a little bit about a case study from the United States, and then I'll move to another obscure culture, Western Australia. And then lastly, I'll just leave you with some questions that might relate to restoration in Victoria. I had three inspirations for this talk, really. One of those inspirations was that I looked at the media release for World Environment Day by the United Nations. This year, World Environment Day is virtually hosted by the government of Pakistan. And I was really interested to see some of the Pakistani government's perspective on World Environment Day. So they talk very much here about their program called 10 billion tree tsunami, which is an attempt over 5 years to restore mangroves and forests. But they also then go on to talk about planting trees in urban settings, including schools, colleges, public parks and green belts. And I looked at this and I thought, this isn't sort of where I come from when it comes to ecosystem restoration. I think of ecosystem restoration as very much taking an ecosystem back to some state before, you know, the modern industrial revolution started causing major changes to it. I don't think of it so much as planting trees in urban settings. And in some ways that reaction relates to my second inspiration, which is this one. Earlier this year, I attended one of the TERN webinars. TERN's the Australian Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. And of these three speakers, Hupel, Bayraktarov and Tickle, when Michelle Hupel was introducing it, she put up this diagram from Cluel and Aronson's old ecology textbook, pointing out that restoration's a complex problem and it has ecological, socio-economic and institutional contexts. So in some ways, my reaction to the Pakistani government's media release was really that I've come from more of an ecological context underpinned by science, but the Pakistani government comes from an institutional and socio-economic context. And really it's these different perspectives which generated my initial reaction to what they expressed as priorities during World Environment Day. My third inspiration is this man, Stuart Harrison. I don't know how many of you might recognise them, but Stuart Harrison is the host of a television show that appears on the ABC. It's called Restoration Australia. And Restoration Australia looks at individual or private house owners restoring historic houses. This is one example from the current series, Rosenthal Homestead near Warwick in Queensland. And really each of the shows looks at the process by which homeowners go through the understanding of the history of their house, how it might once have been, and then the restorations in order to bring it up to a modern and livable standard. The press release, and again it's a press release, but the press release when this show was being introduced last year reads along these lines, and I'll read it because it's quite important. Across 8 episodes, Restoration Australia host, architect and historian Stuart Harrison will take viewers on a journey around the country, meeting some of Australia's bravest heritage warriors as they transform ruins into remarkable historic homes. The process of transforming these homes to turn them into forever homes isn't always straightforward and simple. To faithfully restore heritage homes with original fixtures and fittings, they first must replace termite-damaged floors, water-damaged walls and rotten ceilings. Some homes don't even have all 4 walls or a front door. In fact, one has been lying flat-packed on a bush block for decades, waiting to be reassembled and brought back to life. It's Stuart's job to help the homeowners on the journey, not only investigating their home's historic past, but also providing advice, support and insight into the restoration process. With often tight budgets and limited timeframes, the challenge is to help them protect the past while creating beautiful and functional homes for the present, without compromising what they fell in love with in the first place. Now, there's a lot in there actually for an ecologist. Just to take the creating beautiful and functional homes for the present part, we need to understand that most homeowners actually don't want their Warwick homestead to be exactly the same as it was in 1840, because the kitchen wasn't up to date. There wasn't a flush toilet. There was no big screen TV connected to the NBN. And certainly the home had pretty limited heating and especially cooling. And so if we look at the trends for Queensland and its tendency for increasing temperatures in coming decades, then you might want to look at installing air conditioning, also not available in the 1840s. But actually, when you look at this little bit of text, there's something for an ecologist in many places. So this part in the middle that talks about replacing termite damaged floors, water damaged walls and rotten ceilings, possibly not even having all four walls and a front door. The ecological analogue for all of that is really ecosystem function. Those are functional things that you need to have in a house, and so really there's an ecosystem function underpinning for restoration in the first place. There's also the issue of investigating the historic past. So what do we actually know of the previous condition or state or function or composition of the ecosystem that we're interested in restoring? How much do we really know? There's the business about budgets and timeframes. Every ecological restoration project has a limited budget and usually a time frame for some outcome. That becomes an issue for ecological restoration as well. And then there's the challenge of creating a beautiful and functional home for the present and possibly the future. So what do we actually value now? Is that necessarily exactly the same as the ecosystem might have been in the past? Are there things like climate change that we need to be planning for in the future? So the real bottom line focus for this talk, the take-home messages are really these two things about making implicit things which are often making things which are previously implicit in notions of restoration absolutely explicit in our thinking. So one of those is the historical frame of reference. How do we know what we think we know about the past of an ecosystem? And for me, this is a philosophical question of epistemology, which that's basically what that question is. How do we know what we think we know? And the other part of it is, what are our current values? What do we really want to achieve? And are we being completely honest and accurate in that space? So like Stuart Harrison, I can also lean right in frame for a cool looking photo, even if I am a bit more ugly and my dress sense is less suave. But there's one other thing that I should say, to be completely honest and open. I'm actually not a specialist ecosystem restoration expert. My background's much more general in ecology, especially aspects of applied ecology, but I've found throughout the last 30 years that I've been coming up against questions of restoration, and often I find that my background provides some sort of a friction around some of the assumptions around frame of reference or values that are being articulated or failed to be articulated when it comes to ecosystem research. And so, as I said, I'm going to take an anthropological perspective and start somewhere completely different, not in my home culture, because you end up with this conflict of interest, an intellectual conflict of interest if you talk about your own culture. So in 2005, I moved from a job in New Zealand to a job in Reno in the western part of Nevada. Reno is an ugly 500,000 people city with casinos in its centre and a whole pile of urban sprawl around it. Reno itself sits here on the western edge of a place called the Great Basin. The Great Basin is a high desert of mountain ranges and valleys in between them. And by high, I mean the average elevation is something like 2,000 metres above sea level. Reno itself is also only about 4 hours drive from San Francisco. Some idea of what the Great Basin looks like. Here's an example from the Desert Toya Range. So here you can see these big wide valleys at about 1,500 metres above sea level, and on both the west and the east side of this valley there's a mountain range which gets up towards 2,500 or 2,800 metres above sea level, so quite high. This is a winter desert, it's a cold desert, so precipitation is almost exclusively in the winter and in the form of snow. There's almost no rain in the Great Basin. The vegetation in the valleys tends to be sagebrush, which is a species of Artemisia, and on the mountain ranges we get various forms of conifer forest, and in the foreground you can see something called pinyon and juniper, which tends to be on the fringes of these valleys. Because I was completely new to this ecosystem, I thought it was essential that in my first year of being in Reno, I should take every opportunity to go on field trips with others who had worked in the system for much longer, to go on every open day visit to an experimental site and so on. And I found it a great learning experience to go and hear others talk about these ecosystems and to see how that related to the history of ecology that I had brought from Australia and New Zealand background previously. And there was a very memorable incident in my very first summer when I joined a field trip to an experimental site, and with a group of academic researchers and researchers from the US Forest Service, I was standing in this location. The location has a small number of sagebrush shrubs that don't look particularly healthy as the ground cover, and then it's got pinyon and juniper trees standing somewhere between 3 and 5 metres tall around it, and you can see them going up more densely onto the mountains in the background. And at this site, most of the people in the group told me that this is a sagebrush site. It should be a sagebrush site. There should be no pinyon and juniper on it. And I'm looking at this site going, wow, pinyon and juniper trees can grow really well on this site. This just looks like a successional pathway to me. With enough time, it looks like pinyon and juniper will establish in sagebrush and ultimately exclude it until the next major disturbance event. But there was this very strong message that this was a sagebrush site. And as a result, if this is a sagebrush site, the presence of pinyon and juniper is regarded as an encroachment process. And you can see the negative connotation already in the word encroachment. It's an undesirable change from a sagebrush site type. The response to such an undesirable change at this site is to manipulate it. In actual fact, to restore it to its sagebrush condition. And in this particular case, site restoration consists of chopping trees down. Chopping these trees down has the lovely term mastication, because in extremis, not only do you chop the trees down, but you put them through a chipper and create basically wood mulch, which you spray around on the site. Having chopped the trees down, there's then an opportunity for the small number of sagebrush, and you can see here there's a small number of sagebrush poking up through the dead canopies of these chopped down trees. You allow the sagebrush to re-grow. So this is site restoration, and I'd never seen site restoration of this type, and I'm going, this doesn't look like site restoration. What is going on? This was a really strong cognitive dissonance for me as an alien ecologist, and remember, everyone who's not born in America is defined as an alien. So what I'm seeing is a transition from sagebrush shrubland to pinyon juniper woodland that looks like completely normal succession. There are no non-native species involved. In fact, there are no non-local native species involved. So where does this notion of should be sagebrush come from? Now, it's not the first cognitive dissonance I've had. I've had several examples of this experience of cognitive dissonance when I've heard people talk about ecosystems and restoration. So a few years before Reno, I had had the opportunity to go to Cambridge, and I visited Professor Peter Grubb there. And Peter took me out to this site, Haley Wood, which he described as primary forest. It's mainly a forest of oak trees, but it's mixed with a few other deciduous species as well. But as I was looking at this forest, I noticed that trees had been coppiced, that is, chopped off at 1 to 1.5 metres above ground level, and the trees then resprout. And I pointed this out to Peter, and he said, oh yes, the management regime in here is a 17-year rotation of coppicing. And I thought, so how's this a primary forest, which the literature tells me is undisturbed, when every 17 years forest managers come in and coppice the trees? was particularly strong given that I'd just come from New Zealand, where there are kauri trees such as this one, which is the oldest known kauri tree in New Zealand and has the name Tane Mahuta. This tree is estimated to be something like 40,000 years old. Sorry, 4,000 years old, don't want to exaggerate. I saw a few shocked faces there. 4,000 years old, and the first 3,000 years of its life, it saw no humans in its environment at all. The Polynesian settlers, the Maori, only show up something like 800 or 900 years before the present. So this tree has essentially established and grown for most of its life in the absence of people. This, for me, is primary forest. And so the idea of a coppiced oak forest in England was not the same as my idea of primary forest. But I'd had this cognitive dissonance even earlier, and this example is more like Reno. I went to work for CSIRO in Alice Springs in 1991, and again, I tried to go out with as many of my colleagues on field trips as possible. I went to this particular site to the east of Alice Springs, Todd River Station, and in this particular site, there is a great densification going on of seedlings and saplings of the dominant acacia, which is ironwood, this larger tree in the background. There's clearly a shift going on in this ecosystem. And my colleague at the time called this ironwood encroachment, again, a negative connotation. So the idea that there was a thickening of the ironwood community was seen as negative. And what I realised when I thought about my colleague was he'd arrived in Central Australia to work in about 1975. In 1973 and 1974, there had been an enormous rainfall event. There was something like 1,000 millimetres in one year and 800 millimetres of rain in the other. That's like 4 to 5 times the mean annual rainfall. And after that, there were enormous bushfires because of the amount of standing grass in the ecosystem. And so the fires had a huge mortality effect on most of the tree and shrub species in Central Australia over very large areas. So the consequence was that my colleague arrived in Central Australia at a time immediately after large widespread disturbance, and he saw the least woody form of those ecosystems, and ever since they've been in a successional pathway of increasing woodiness. So it's not necessarily that he was wrong or I was wrong, but it was that we have different frames of reference when it comes to understanding the processes that were going on and different degrees of consciousness of that understanding. So let's go back to the US and our pinyon juniper encroaching woodlands. This is just from a different location. There's just a couple of basic things that's worth pointing out about pinyon juniper woodlands from a pure ecological perspective. So one is the form of these woodlands varies a bit depending on how much precipitation they get and whether the precipitation is primarily in winter as snow or whether it's summer as rainfall. So when you're down in Texas, which is the most southern end of the distribution, it's relatively moist and the rain comes in summer. You get a savanna woodland. If you're in higher rainfall parts of places like Nevada, you get a wooded shrubland, so it's mainly sagebrush in the understory. And if you're in extremely low rainfall conditions, you tend to just get incredibly sparse shrubs and incredibly sparse grasses in the understory and quite persistent woodlands. And these alternate states are maintained by the fire regime as well. So there's a set of reinforcing positive feedback loops to control the form of these ecosystems. So when you're in Texas and you've got savanna with grassy understory, there tend to be very frequent fires, grass fires. They tend to be moderate to intense surface fires, but they don't often get into the tree canopies, and there's usually only low to moderate tree mortality. So the spaces in between the shrubs are maintained fairly open and grassy, but there's always trees in that system. If you come to the higher rainfall parts of, say, the Great Basin in Nevada, the shrublands burn much less frequently. You tend to get moderate to extensive canopy fire when it does burn. And usually because the canopies are not particularly continuous, again, you get low to moderate tree mortality and you maintain this open but shrubby woodland. When you're in the driest parts of Nevada, the fires are incredibly infrequent. It's very unlikely that there's enough grass and shrub between the trees to allow a lightning strike to be spread across the landscape. And so it's only in incredibly extreme fire weather conditions with high winds and high temperatures that you're likely to get a canopy fire which will move from tree to tree. And under those circumstances, you get very high tree mortality. So in those cases, there's persistent woodlands, then there's a sudden transition to almost no woodland at all, and then there would be a very slow re-establishment process for pinyon and juniper to return to such a site. The other thing worth remembering about basic pinyon and juniper ecology is that the zone of pinyon and juniper sits along a precipitation and elevation gradient. So at the low precipitation, low elevation end in the Great Basin, you've got a sagebrush, pure sagebrush community. And as we go up the elevation gradient and we get higher precipitation, we're likely to get pinyon and juniper. Then we get a transition into Jeffrey pine, and then we get a transition into white fir, and at extremely high elevation, we get into red fir as well. And there's some suggestion that because of changes to land management since European settlement in this landscape, these zones have shifted a bit. So there's a bit more sagebrush probably, and the pinyon and juniper is now a bit further up the mountain, as is the Jeffrey pine. At each of these interfaces, say sagebrush versus pinyon, there's a clear dynamic going on. It's likely that if you have a fire, initially sagebrush will establish, and then if there's a long enough time frame before the next fire, then pinyon and juniper will have sufficient seed dispersal to establish on the site and become a woodland. The same can be said about the pinyon juniper interface. So if you have at high rainfall at higher elevation, if you've got pinyon juniper, it's likely that at some stage Jeffrey pine seed will disperse into it, and eventually it will grow tall enough to overtop the pinyon and juniper. The same process happens at the interface between Jeffrey pine and white fir. After a disturbance and after a grassy period, Jeffrey pine will establish, and then after sufficient time, white fir is able to establish in the shade of the Jeffrey pine. All right, so now let's go back to these questions of historical frame of reference and current values. I would argue that our subjective responses to each of these issues is where this should be sagebrush comment comes from when you're standing in a pinyon and juniper woodland on some sites. And I'd like to illustrate this in some detail. I'll start with the current values and then I'll go back to historical frame of reference. So let's look at values. The main land value in the Great Basin is cattle ranching. And the main thing that cattle eat are the grass between sagebrush, and under extreme drought conditions, they'll also eat sagebrush. But there is absolutely no way they're going to eat pinyon and juniper. As a result, sagebrush with grass between it is good, and pinyon juniper woodlands, especially as they become denser and has less grass in the understory, they become bad. So the solution is to improve the amount of good, and that is masticate the pinyon and juniper trees, chop them down, and we then interpret and communicate this as restoration. It's actually restoration for cattle ranching, but we communicate it more generally as restoration. There's actually a direct analogue at that interface between Jeffrey pine and white fir that I just talked about. So if you look at that interface, you're quite likely to see this, which is where tall Jeffrey pine trees have white fir saplings in the understory. And as I indicated, white fir tends to germinate in shady conditions. So this is completely natural in many ways. However, there's a hidden value in here, which is timber production. Jeffrey pine is a very high quality wood, and therefore Jeffrey pine dominated sites are inherently good from a timber production perspective. White fir has a completely useless wood. It's not even useful for pulping for wood production, for paper production. So white fir is inherently bad. So faced with this at the interface between Jeffrey pine and white fir, the solution, of course, is to masticate the understory of white fir saplings and leave the Jeffrey pine trees in place. And again, this is interpreted and communicated as restoration of Jeffrey pine forest. So the other part of the challenge for me is, what's a historical frame of reference when we're thinking about these pinyon and juniper ecosystems? How long are our individual and communal memories? We know, for example, that our memories are actually pretty short, and that's one of the issues underpinning the notion of the shifting baseline syndrome, where over generations you can get gradually degraded ecosystems which are considered good quality because that generation has never seen the previous version of the ecosystem and had the opportunity to recognise that there might be something even better. So if you're faced with a very short memory as an individual or a community, can we go to other sources of historical information? What do we have available and how do we understand it? So in the Western US, historical photographs are particularly valuable for being, or in terms of use for interpreting ecological change. There was a US Forest Service employee called George Gruhl at the start of the 20th century and also at the late 19th century, who took lots of landscape photographs around the Western US. Here's one example that he took in 1906 near Phillipsburg in Montana. And after people became aware of this, there was a strong movement in the 1980s and subsequently to go back to the same sites and re-photograph them as close as people could get. And so the right-hand photo is an attempt by another US Forest Service researcher to find that same site and re-photograph it. And in fact, there's a book where on the left-hand side is one of George Gruhl's photos and on the right-hand side is a much more recent photograph of the same site. And you can see, if we look at this comparison, that there's actually quite a lot of open country in George Gruhl's photo from 1906, and almost all of it now is quite mature forest in the photo taken in 1981. And this is a general trend comparing Gruhl's photos to ones which were taken in the 80s and 90s. And so this is seen as evidence of this idea of encroaching trees into otherwise open community types. So they're being used widely since the 80s, and in many ways they reinforce this notion of trees being bad because trees are encroaching onto otherwise more open ecological types. The problem is that even the earliest of these photos dates from the late 1980s, and in most states in the US, European settlement predates that by decades in most cases. And there are likely to have been impacts between the arrival of Europeans and the time of the photograph, the first photograph, which leads you then to question the validity of the photos as a satisfactory frame of reference when it comes to, historically informed restoration, if you like. So just thinking about Nevada, Nevada was explored in inverted commas by Mexican missionaries around 1776 as they were establishing California as a series of missions. It was also explored around the 1820s and 1830s by Mormons who were looking for a place to settle and eventually chose Utah. In 1859, there is the discovery of gold and silver in western Nevada, and that was the so-called Comstock Gold Rush. And this leads to a substantial increase in the population in the area, and it leads to Nevada going from being a territory to being a state in very short time frame. What happens during those early periods before, say, 1880 and the first photographs? Well, one is we know that there's been a change in the amount of fire in these pinyon and juniper woodlands. So here's some data from one of my colleagues in Nevada and his student, John Bauer. On the x-axis, we've got the calendar year from 1400 to 2000, and on the y-axis, we've got the number of trees in which a fire was recorded in that particular year. And these data come from tree cores. So this is taking cores through the trunks of trees, looking at the tree rings and being able to date those correctly to year, and then looking for black marks in tree rings as indication of fire. And you can see that up until about 1700, there are occasional fires which are being recorded on occasional trees. And to some extent, the idea of finding a 600-year-old tree might be a little bit rich, and so the relative paucity of observations could be due to a few trees. But even the trees that survive tend to only have evidence of one fire at this particular time, or one fire per decade at best. If you look at the time since 1700 to 1900, there's lots of trees bearing fire scars for each individual event, and the number of events per decade or per century increases dramatically. There's like a 2 orders of magnitude increase in the amount of fire in this landscape. But then if you look at what happens from 1900s onwards, fire disappears again, and this relates to the maximum period of grazing and potentially periods of fire suppression. So there's a period of about 200 years where there's a lot of fire in this landscape. So what are the possible causes? Well, one is we know about 17 to 1800 the Little Ice Age ends, and there could be changes to ecosystem productivity and or flammability that might have led to increased spread of fire in this landscape. We also know that from the time of first mission settlement in the Western US, we start to see changed land management practice by the traditional owners, the First Nation people. And from about 1820 or 1830 onwards, we start to see shepherds in this landscape who are doing open range sheep ranching and almost certainly generating fire either deliberately to produce grassy regrowth or accidentally as a result of fires escaping from their huts or their campsites. But much more important, I think, is mining. As I said, mining starts in Nevada in 1859, and by 1870, 11 years later, there are gold and silver mines all over Nevada. There's a huge demand for wood. Wood is used for props in the mine shafts themselves, and at high precipitation areas, Jeffrey pine is preferred. At low precipitation, juniper is preferred. And then the other use of timber is to make charcoal for smelting, and pinyon pine is perfect for the production of charcoal. The combination of all of this demand leads to logging. And I think it's really interesting at this point to note that the first ranches in Nevada were not cattle ranches, they were actually timber ranches. So they were licenses from the US federal government to gather timber, not to graze cattle. And we have evidence of the consequences of this demand, especially for charcoal. So these are permanent structures at high elevation in Death Valley National Park, where there are 9 charcoal kilns that have been constructed to have controlled burning to produce charcoal. This is Death Valley, but at high elevation, more than 2,000 metres above sea level, in a place with not much timber in the modern period. But there must have been quite a supply of timber at this site for someone to invest in permanent charcoal kilns. We've got charcoal platforms. So this is where charcoal was produced in the open rather than in kilns themselves. And there are hundreds of these across Nevada too. They're just a black scorched area on the soil. We have photographs which show the extent of logging around Lake Tahoe around 1870. So this is a timber mill in the foreground. There's timber on the wharf here to be shipped to the other end of the lake. If you look at all the trees, they're almost all white fir. There isn't a Jeffrey pine in sight. It's like there's been selective logging in this landscape. My colleague Peter Weisberg and I had a postdoctoral fellow, Dong-Wook Ko, and part of Dong-Wook Ko's work was to look at an area of central Nevada and do 2 things. Examine the historical records to see whether we could find evidence and possibly even quantify the extent of logging to support the mining industry. And then secondarily, using a few simple assumptions about the potential distribution of pinyon juniper, haulage distances and the availability of railways, the locations of known charcoal platforms and things like slope as a potential control of harvesting. He developed a simulation model to estimate how much land would need to have been logged in order to supply the amount of timber on record. If you look at the historical mining records, they're phenomenal. In the total period 1865 to 1895, this desert landscape, and I stress it's a desert landscape, produces 1.8 million tonnes of timber for the mining industry alone. It's not necessarily all of the domestic industry here. And if you look at the extent to which there may have been impacts of that logging, almost the entire study area has tree removal to some degree. The places which are shown here in dark are the places where we think it was likely completely deforested because of the ease of access and the amount of demand from the mines. The places in a paler grey, there may have been selective logging or logging on less steep parts of the landscape. And you can see that this pattern reflects the modern distribution of woodlands on these mountain ranges as well. So that most of the intermediate areas are just sagebrush desert and salt lakes. It's the only wood available is on these individual ranges. So if you put all of those things together, you end up with a pretty complex set of dynamics around what could be influencing pinyon and juniper. We've got the mining boom, increasing population, there's charcoal demand by mines, there's probably domestic fuel wood and lumber demands leading to tree harvest, and we would expect probably a decrease in the distribution of trees in the landscape. There's also increased demand for sheep and cattle grazing in order to feed people. There's a real fear of fire in the landscape, so there's a lot of firefighting and suppression. The First Nations people are excluded from the landscape, and so there would be a decreased use of traditional burning regime. And so there's probably less pinyon and juniper by the end of the 19th century, but an enormous potential to regrow in the 20th, which is probably leading to what we're seeing, at least in part. And then there's possibly the effects of climate change in this system as well. If your frame of reference is the George Gruhl photos, and so you only think about what's happened since 1900, you tend to only see the processes which are on the right-hand side of this diagram. If you also look at these other historical records about mining and so on, you see much more complexity, and you see this business of pinyon and juniper decrease and the potential regrowth. So that I would argue that here, potential regrowth is not necessarily sagebrush being invaded, but actually pinyon and juniper regrowing on a site that was previously that vegetation type. So going back to those photos of encroachment and restoration, really the encroachment restoration is a post-1900 view of the world, but a pre-1900 view of this landscape would suggest that we have succession or reforestation going on. And if we're being honest about that, then what's happening on the right-hand side is not quite restoration, it's actually woodland clearance for grazing value. So I think this is really important, going back to my points that I started with. Do we really know what we think we know? If our time frame of historical knowledge is only 1880 or 1900, have we only got a partial picture? Do we actually need a longer historical time frame to really get a sense of how this system functions and how the current state relates to that? And then secondarily, how do values play out in this restoration space? Are we being completely honest and transparent about what we want to achieve? So let me just whip you through a couple of examples in Australia. I'm very conscious of the time here. Let's apply the same lens to Australia. I've talked a little bit about Central Australia, but I don't want to focus on that. I'm going to give you a mine site restoration in Western Australia, and then a more local question of restoration from paddocks. So let's look at Western Australia. In southwest Western Australia, there is bauxite mining. It happens on the Darling Range, quite close to Perth. This range is blanketed by laterite deposits, which are rich in bauxite, but they also happen to be home to the Jarrah Forest ecosystem. And Alcoa has licenses to strip mine the laterite in the state forests on the range, but not in national parks. So what's going on is they're looking at Jarrah Forest like this. The Jarrah Forest sits on the range here in the centre of this map on the left side, between the coastal plain and the wheat belt. These soils are absolutely terrible for agriculture, which is why Jarrah was never cleared for agriculture and why we still have Jarrah forest on the range itself. But you can see down here around these locations of Solus and Bankshire that there's quite a lot of disturbance going on. And if you zoom in, you see with the pattern on the right. This is strip mining of the bauxite. The Jarrah forest is being removed. The top 2 to 5 metres of laterite is stripped off. It's taken by truck to this central location, and then it goes on a conveyor belt down to Pinjarra here at the bottom of the map, where there's a processing plant, which we can even see from space because of the waste deposits around the processing plant. The mining licence requires ecosystem restoration after the mining has been finished. And Alcoa does its best. You can see it from a satellite. Here's restoration taking place in the Jarrah forest. You can see there's lots of lines here. So there's contour ploughing going on, and then there are lines of tree planting and so on in this particular landscape. It ends up not looking too bad. So this is revegetation in the foreground as opposed to mature or undisturbed forest here. And, you know, after 20 years, it looks something like this. Spindly, dense trees, which is perhaps what you expect in a succession pathway. But Alcoa faced some competing values. While the EPA says that it requires ecosystem restoration, it also said that there's an urgency to protect the Perth watershed in terms of water yield and erosion control. And Alcoa also sensed public anger over the scale of the removal of the Jarrah forest. And so there's a need to quickly cover the scars to generate forest cover. And over 40 years, there's been quite a learning journey. So the initial focus was on replacing tree cover as fast as possible in order to generate watershed protection and remove the public anger as much as possible. So they planted tree seedlings, they added nitrogen and phosphorus fertiliser to speed the growth. But what they found was that very few understory species established, even if you supply seed or seedlings. So the biodiversity outcomes were not very good, and you could hardly call this ecosystem restoration. There seemed to be two reasons. One was the nitrogen and phosphorus fertiliser actually is toxic for most of the West Australian flora, other than the trees that responded. So while they got tree cover, they are actually inhibiting most of the species from establishing in the site. And then the second thing was, because they're just planting seed and seedling out into essentially a geological formation with no soil, they've made a whole pile of invalid assumptions about succession. The conditions are just inherently harsh for succession to take place. This led to an evolved approach. It takes much more money, and the time frame for a successful outcome increases as well. But it involves retrieving and redistributing the topsoil between locations. It also involves planting and seedling, but no fertiliser, which means it's slower to establish cover and biomass. But the biodiversity outcomes are improving. So because so much effort is put into diverse planting and seeding, there's quite good species composition for the plants themselves, although there's low biomass of many of the species in the understory. There's about 75% recolonisation of species of ants, birds, bats and so on after 30 to 40 years. But in terms of the rarer biodiversity values, it's less convincing. The idea that these habitats are suitable for rare and endangered species is probably not being achieved. So if I look at these ecosystems from the perspective of providing habitat for a numbat, I don't think it's doing it. There's also some unaddressed questions around historic and future frame of reference. So one of the problems is all of the reference sites were logged in the 19th century. You can see huge stumps in some places, but what's actually left are multi-stemmed trees which have resprouted after logging. They tend to have narrow trunks and small canopies. There's probably a flow-on effect to the species composition of the understory. We actually have very little evidence of what the grand old Jarrah forest must have looked like in, say, 1830. What we've got now is a poor cousin of it. The other thing that's happening, of course, is that climate change is very rapid in southwest WA. The rainfall's decreased about 20% in the last 30 years, and we have no idea what that's really going to mean for Jarrah Forest in the near to mid future. So then let's go really local. And I don't want to poke this because this is a program that's only just starting, but I think it's a really interesting one for us to reflect on whether we have got our frames of reference and our values quite sorted in Victoria. So in the 2021 budget, there was an announcement for a new program for growing jobs in land restoration and carbon storage, with the aim of restoring native vegetation and carbon plantings over the next 16 years. A large amount of the money is for restoring carbon storage through revegetation and restoration of native veg, and a smaller pool of funds is for private landowners looking at agroforestry and shelter belts for carbon markets. Bushbank is currently conceived to contribute to revegetation and protecting biodiversity 2037 targets, achieving by 2037 targets, to try and help stop the decline of native plants and animals and improve the natural environment. But it's also supposed to help with the goal of net zero emissions. And for me, these are slightly different values, and I'm not entirely sure that they can be met at the same time, or at least with the same speed. So there's an opportunity here for us to reflect before we get very far along about whether these objectives are really logically consistent and whether we've got evidence that our intended outcomes can be achieved or if there's some trade-off needed. Going back to Stuart and his Restoration Australia TV program, we should be asking whether the objectives can be achieved within budget and time frame. And then going back to the Alcoa example, is it possible we can implement a culture of learning and adaptation in order to make sure that if things don't quite go as we had planned, we're learning fast enough and adapting fast enough that we can capture as much benefit as we can for the future? And I think with that, I'll stop. That's the end. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you very much, Ashley. That was awesome. I think everyone has really enjoyed the entertaining style. You've presented such a thought-provoking presentation. I really appreciate the time and effort you've put into this. You can tell you've actually spent a fair bit of time thinking through these things, and it's just a pleasure to watch it. We have a few moments to go through a couple of questions that have come through. We're still looking for other questions, so feel free to post them in the chat. The first one I'm going to try paraphrase from Rob, and his question is around the cost of restoration, where we should be investing things. And he says, given the cost of restoration and re-establishing ecosystem services in heavily degraded systems, why are we drawn to restoring degraded systems rather than investing in maintaining existing vegetation systems?
That's a really good question. And I would argue that it's probably, again, related to implicit values, where we perhaps perceive that degraded ecosystems have more biodiversity value than they really do, or we're not acknowledging the extent to which they might have lost specific biodiversity values. And then secondarily, I think often we're looking more at the functional aspects of restoration, things like, I don't know, protecting a riparian zone from erosional losses into the stream. We can appear to make quite a large contribution in a space like that with the creation of biomass and vegetation cover and understory and so on. It's quite dramatic, and it may very well have quite an immediate impact on things like sedimentation in the stream. But it's less clear how the same effort in an existing ecosystem might lead to the same magnitude of reduction in, say, sediment in streams. So I think there's a challenge around where our values really are and whether they're quite what we're articulating. You know, the biodiversity versus the functional aspects of ecosystem restoration. And then secondarily, I think there's a difference in appearance of the magnitude of an effect versus the overall potential contribution. I'm no expert in there, but I suspect it's in that space.
I like it. I think that resonates well with what I reckon. So thank you, Ashley. In reframing, this is a question, I guess, of what you're talking about around how we frame things. If we continue to use the word restoration when the ecological values aren't the direct objective of a project, do you think we should be using a different word, or is restoration still okay?
That's also an interesting question, how many words we need. Scientists love to have new terms, to be very specific, but actually it might be just as valuable if we used adjectives. So it could still be restoration, but we're being much clearer about restoration of species composition or biodiversity versus restoration of, catchment function, for example, or carbon storage or something like that. So it might just be that there's an adjective or a description associated with the word restoration that makes it clearer exactly what it is that we think we're restoring. In some cases, I'm not even sure that we're restoring. And the specific example for me is carbon capture. You could simply argue that any vegetation is an efficient way to capture carbon. So you're not restoring, you're simply using. And that removes the notion that the aim is to recreate something from the past, and allows the possibility that we are simply creating something anew in the present and the near future.
Yeah, good. Interesting take. I like it. Another question, this is from Jody. Do you have any thoughts on EVC benchmarks and what they're based on, and how they can be used in determining the quality of vegetation for offsets and restoration?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I have to confess, coming from somewhere else in Australia to Victoria only 4 years ago, I have found EVCs quite challenging. I really don't understand enough of the background of how they were defined. And my perception is that there is a substantial degree of subjectivity in terms of how general or specific EVCs can be. So sometimes I see EVCs that I would interpret as stages of a successional transition. And in other cases, I see EVCs which seem to be highly generalised and allow for all sorts of internal heterogeneity. And so if you have that degree of inconsistency in the definition of an EVC, then there becomes a challenge around what the notion of a benchmark is as well. I don't know enough about the processes by which benchmarks are identified, but I suspect, and there's a slide I didn't produce where I used to rail to my American students about the challenges of separating out the current state of an ecosystem in a particular place from its potential or climax state, from the most likely state in the landscape given the disturbance regimes and so on, versus the desirable state given some particular value that society or an individual might have for that place in the landscape. And in some ways, I think the notion of EVC benchmarks would also benefit from a little bit more flexibility and specificity around whether we're talking about a climax state within which we could have seral states, or whether in actual fact somehow the benchmark is supposed to capture the seral states as well. I think they're challenging, and they do present a potential red herring when it comes to being clear about this historical frame of reference for a site or a landscape.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze in one last question because there's so many flooding in right now. This is a question about rewilding and using non-native species that have similar ecological functions. Do you have a perspective on this?
No, I don't have a particular perspective on that. I think it's a really interesting philosophical question around what our notion of frame of reference is, and whether it's functional or whether it's related to specific species composition. And I think ultimately it might come down to the specific case study and where it sits within people's value system. I suspect it's a case by case thing rather than a generalizable answer.
Awesome job, Ashley. Thank you so much again for presenting today and for answering all these great questions. And thank you to the audience for asking such great questions. Today we've got a feedback form in the chat, so before you leave, if you could fill it out, that'd be greatly appreciated. We're always trying to deliver the best service for all of you, as well as share amazing presentations and research like today. We have another seminar coming up for NAIDOC Week, which is I believe it's the 7th of July we'll be presenting it. And we'll be featuring Dennis Rose from Gudjidjirr Mirring Traditional Owner Group, as well as Wayne Costa from ARI. And they'll be presenting the eel satellite research that they've been doing together in partnership. So thanks again for coming today. If you have any further questions or queries, feel free to contact us. Check the ARI website for the seminar updates and the registrations, as well as the recording from today's session. They'll be up later this week. So feel free to share it amongst your networks. We're always happy to get this stuff out there. So thank you again, Ashley, and thank you, Kim, for introducing today's session. See you guys next time.
Thanks, Andy.